Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and with me today is Ryan Grant, president of Mediatrix Press, and we're here to talk about the Society of Jesus. Welcome, Ryan.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
You know, I think the Jesuit order is probably one of those groups that is not really understood in a modern context because it's changed so much from our perspective. uh, Probably in the last 70 years, would you say?
Well, it certainly has changed dramatically in the last 70 years, but also historically, what it actually is has not always been that well understood by outsiders, both those within the church and those without. And again, the society has been a locus for all sorts of conspiracy theories, pamphlets about Jesuits taking over the world, doing assassinations, and things that could never be substantiated, never really be proven. But they filled the popular imagination, and then also on the other side of dangerous papists that could convert the most devout Protestant into popery in the minds of various Protestants, or again amongst Catholics, seeing them as being the greatest of the great or implacable enemies of various theological currents and whatnot, say efficacious grace or whatever. So historically, it's always been a problem, but the last 70 years particularly have been kind of a question of what is the Jesuit order and why should it still be around.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We'll get to around the end.
Definitely. So, but I think we should start with the beginning. How was the Jesuit order founded?
The Jesuit order was founded in what is very much a political accident, guided by the work of the Holy Ghost. So that it actually all starts with King Henry VIII. And Henry VIII was young and thin and athletic and pious and richer and better educated than any king of England had been in quite some time. So then his hero is Henry V. So he decides he's going to model himself on his hero and go to war in France and restart the 100 Years' War. And he's successful, but he just doesn't have enough money or troops to fight the French, which have a much larger populace and a much larger army. And so but he does defeat them very soundly. And so Louis XII is forced to come to terms. And then Henry declares that, if I decide, the king of France may go to Italy to fight in all the various wars in Italy. And if I say no, then he can't, because this is part of a bigger European conflict that had brought Henry in on the side of the Pope and the Spanish and so many others against the French. So that, so he's sitting pretty. And then Louis XII has to die on him, and instead leave in his place the Count of Angoulême, a younger, more handsome, richer, and even better than Henry was, namely Francois I of France. So now, so he's outclassed Henry in all these things, and he's united the disparate elements of the French nobility under him, which means Henry's military career in France is basically over. And so that's a blow to his heart. But then an even younger, newer, hipper, more powerful monarch gets on the stage, and that's Carlos I of Spain, who was also Charles, Duke of the Burgundy, Lord of Flanders, and now he becomes the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And so he has territory all around the French, and is richer and more powerful than Henry is, but he's also, related to the Queen, to Catherine of Aragon. So the political matchmaking begins working. And then meanwhile in Spain, there's a revolt, the revolt of the Comuneros. The nobility is not happy that their king is now the Holy Roman Emperor, spending most of his time in Germany and sucking out all this gold and silver from the New World to pay his troops to go in this interminable fight against the French again. And so they revolt, and they want to get a new king. And this becomes a hard fought at first, and eventually Charles does, come on the head of the conflict. He goes to England. He borrows money from Henry VIII. He promises to make Colonel Wolsey Pope, and all these things. And at the very last, he is, he does make his way back to France. So in the meantime, there's this other part of Spain called Navarre, and part of it's in France and part of it's in Spain. And so Ferdinand, Isabella's husband, he had taken a good chunk of the better parts of Navarre for himself, and the Basque people that lived there weren't particularly happy about this. So as the Comuneros revolt rises up in Spain, they watch this with morbid fascination, and they send their emissaries over to the French king, Francois I, and said, "Oh, would you mind coming over and kicking Charles while he's down, and send your troops over here into Navarre? And we promise that we'll be obedient. We won't be as troublesome for you as we were for Charles," and more or less. And so Francois smiles and he says, "Oh, I would love nothing more than to kick Charles while he's down. So I'm just going to come over." And so he sends, not an army in earnest. He just doesn't mean to get bogged down there, but he does send troops over, and they decide to strike at the main citadel of Spanish power, which is in Pamplona. And the guard was very lightly kept, and they all wanted to surrender. But one of the soldiers there, one Inigo, he says, "No, we're not going to surrender to those lousy French. We're going to fight." And he gets all their courage up, and they do, and they fight, and he heroically keeps up their courage, and he comes up with several very ingenious things, like having the men hold up, very big, heavy, canvas, like for sails on ships, to take some of the strength out of the cannonballs as they're hitting the walls and whatnot. But it's all in vain. Eventually the walls are breached, and Inigo is taken down by shrapnel from a cannon shot that blows through one of his legs and into the other one. So he's out, and then after that the morale drops, and Pamplona surrenders to the French. The French were so impressed with his valor and his bravery, because they expected the thing to fall, not to last for 2 days. So they allow the captain, Inigo, to be taken back to his ancestral house in Loyola. And thus you have the rest of the story, which everyone knows the other part, that sitting in the castle, Inigo he takes the name Ignatius in Italy, but we'll call him Ignatius for now. He's reading, old tales of courtly love, and or he wants to, but they don't have any in the house. He's like, "Come on, where's the Knights books? Lives of the Saints? Are you kidding me? I haven't done that." But finally, he's like, "Well, I got nothing else to do." As I sit there, the doctor said to come in and re-break his leg and then reset it, because the previous doctor didn't do it correctly. So he'll always walk with a limp, for the rest of his life. He's never going to be moving about again like he used to. So he reads the Life of Christ and the Lives of the Saints by Jacobus de Voragine, and as he goes through he's struck by the life and example, and he's just inflamed with the love of God, and especially the life of Saint Francis interested him, because Francis uses this very similar Romanesque type of gallant errantry talk, lady poverty, lady humility, a poor knight for Christ, and the language in which he couches everything. It spoke to Inigo, wanted to be a knight as well. And so, but now he changes his whole life around to become a knight for Christ. And so he makes his way to Montserrat after he's healed, very much against his family's wishes. They're like, "Come on, no, don't do." Oh, he's gone crazy, right? He's going all religious. Oh, well, it'll burn itself out eventually. But it didn't. He goes to Montserrat. He offers his sword to the Blessed Virgin Mary there at Montserrat, and then gives all of his rich and noble clothes to a beggar, and in exchange for the beggar's rags. And he goes around begging and spending his time in a cave, where he goes through this very deep meditation. He suffers incredible temptations. On the one hand, the devil tempts him to believe he can never be saved. His sins are so bad he can never be forgiven for anything. And he overcomes that, and by God's grace and the direction of a good priest. And then the devil tries to tempt him again. After a few months where he comes to relative peace, the devil tempts his pride. "Oh, you've become so holy. You've become so great. Why, you could never sin again. Any sin you did before is like nothing because you become so holy." So then, to get this temptation out of his head, he goes to the holy women that he's working with for giving alms, and then make sure he's got something to eat. And he has them remind him of his sins, daily, so that whenever he'll see them, that way, they try to drive the temptation of pride out. And so as he goes through this major spiritual work, he writes, what becomes the spiritual exercises in the future. And so the work of purging the soul of worldliness and love of the world, and having the love for Christ, seeing the effects and the feelings of the soul. And so it begins here, but he's not an educated man either. So it's some time before he reworks this into the form we see today. And then he decides he's going to go to the Holy Land and preach to the infidels. So he gets on a ship and takes that all the way from Spain to Jerusalem, and then he gets off the boat, and the Franciscans who run the Holy Land, they grab him. They say, you're one of these crazy adventurers, and you're going to get a lot of people killed because you're going to take off and they're going to just start killing people. So we can't allow you to do that. So we want you to get back on that boat and send yourself back to Spain. Which he does. He does make the pilgrimage through the various sites. He sees the holy feet, the imprint of our Lord's feet at the Ascension, which by tradition, a lot of people look askance at that one, but the tradition holds that, and many people have venerated it. So if that's at least good for that much. And
Where is that?
On the mountain from whence Christ ascended into heaven. Trying to remember, it wasn't Tabor, because I can't remember. It's in Luke's gospel explicitly where he takes them all as he ascends into heaven. Like, I'm just drawing a blank on it right now. But nevertheless, so that they have a spot there where the feet are implanted, where that event is by tradition held to have happened. So
wow.
And so again, academics, of course, don't believe that very much, but if nothing else, Ignatius and many other saints were there venerating that. So that's something. But so Ignatius makes his way back to Spain, and he decides, well, all right, God, that's what I thought I was supposed to do. So I guess I need some education now. So he goes to the University of Alcala, which was founded by Cardinal Jimenez a few decades earlier. And Cardinal Jimenez was one of the really truly great reforming prelates in Spain. The Reformation never happened in Spain because Jimenez had kept a lot of the abuses out, as well as increased learning and so many other things. So the Spanish church was in a much stronger position than other places in Christendom. So Ignatius sits down to learn Latin, which is the very first thing. And so he does so with boys about half his age or younger. And bit of a terrifying prospect, actually, as an adult, to sit amongst the boys. And Latin was the most important thing you could learn, because that was the mark of an educated man. Eloquentia Latina meant that you were educated, and not speaking Latin meant you were not educated, no matter how you might otherwise be. That's just the way it was.
It reminds me of Newman. He had to go back to school when he became a Catholic priest, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's correct. Although his Latin was extremely good, so it wasn't for that.
Sure. But different experience, but similar, like the age differences. That's
right. Yeah, so Ignatius, he gets that basic bedrock of all study. So Latin grammar, and then after that, logic and rhetoric. And that was the cornerstone. Even in the humanist education, that trivium was still the cornerstone, because you needed to learn to speak correctly, to speak in Latin. Then you needed to learn to speak and argue correctly, and that's what the logic is for. And then you needed to sound good while doing it, and that's what the rhetoric is for. So after that, he decided to go to Salamanca, and this is where he runs into his first bit of trouble. He's teaching people locally catechism and other things, and he has some followers with him, and they wear a common habit. And of course, what's one of the things at this time, after this is the same time the Reformation is going on in Germany, and Spain, of course, has traditions of heretics and secret societies and many things that church authorities are kind of on the lookout for. So the local Inquisition sees this and says, all right, well, there's a problem with this here. So they throw Ignatius into jail, and then they examine him, and they find that there's nothing erroneous in his doctrine, but just to make sure, he's not allowed to teach anybody locally for a number of years. And so he says, okay, I'll accept that. But that only applies here in Salamanca. So he ends up going to, with some encouragement and help of others and a local cardinal that likes him, he ends up going to France, to the University of Paris, the Sorbonne. And he goes in the Latin quarter, is where all generally there's a lot of Spaniards or whatnot would take up. And then he gets stuck in a room with another Basque, because somebody said, hey, he's Basque, and here's another Basque in this room. But they hated each other, because Ignatius might have been a Basque, but he fought for the Spanish, and the other in there was one Francesco Javier, or Francis Xavier. And his older brothers were shooting at St. Ignatius back in Pamplona.
Yeah.
So they don't become very fast friends. And he looks at this Ignatius, the Spanish soldier that seems is like a bookworm or something like that, whereas Francis Xavier, on the other hand, he's looking to conquer the world. He's looking to be the most athletic and cosmopolitan, smart guy, and then he's going to get ordained and get a decree of nobility and be like the top dude back in Navarre, and where they don't have a whole lot of culture and a whole lot of things. And so he'll kind of be in the commanding of his little world, as it were. So, and that's his goal. And he hangs out with a lot of people that later will be hanged for heresy after the affair of the placards and things like that. No idea the danger that his soul is in. And so Ignatius recognizes this, and he quickly gains followers here. The first one is his other roommate, now Saint Peter Faber. And Faber was already a diocesan priest, and he was taking further study at the university. And and then several others that got attracted to them, some Spaniards and some French, and they became a close unit. And eventually Ignatius won the heart of Francis Xavier, and he too joins that band. And then he begins to unfold the spiritual exercises now. And now that he has learning and science to apply to it, he redrafts the spiritual exercises more to the form that we see them now. And so he opens up the meditation for Francis Xavier. What good is it? Ponder the words of our Lord. What good is it to conquer the whole world, but lose your soul? And this is where, Francis Xavier again is moving, and now he's on fire for the gospel. And then his family finds out about it. They're like, we got to do something about this. And so they send a decree of, they get a decree of nobility drawn up, which these are actually kind of fun. So you get a decree that says that basically affirms that you've never worked with your hands, not one day in your life, because that's what's necessary to be a true noble legally. And, by the authority of Charles V, who had been very surprised to see his authority invoked for this particular document, he is, now declared nobles. He just kind of torched it and went off with Ignatius. So the they all come together and they take vows, private vows, to what we now call a de facto association. And this is really the origin of the Jesuits. And they all vow that they're going to go to the Holy Land together. So Ignatius goes back to Spain to settle affairs. They travel, which is a bit dangerous because the wars between Francois I and Charles V are still going on. And and if they get captured along the way, Spaniards or French, depending on which side captures them, half of them are going to be in trouble. And at one point they did, one of them had to temporarily pawn his breviary to get the money to get the French to let them out of prison because he was a Spaniard. And then I think it was Bombadilla, it was one of the first Jesuits. And so then he had to beg for money in order to get the breviary back from the pawnbroker.
Wild.
So they make their way to Venice, and then Ignatius meets them there. And so now, and they're looking to take a pilgrim ship, but there's Charles V and Pope Paul III that just signed in Venice. They've all signed a treaty to go to war against the Turks. So no pilgrim ships are going to be on the sea because they're going to be taken and everyone's going to be sold into slavery. So they decide then to, since there's no pilgrim ships to be had, they decide to go down to see the Pope and offer themselves to his service. And that's precisely what they did. And the Pope, they find, very thankfully, was minded to the reform of the church, namely Pope Paul III. Pope Paul III, who was a Farnese cardinal, the life of the party, as it were, under Alexander VI and Julius II. But sometime later in Julius II's reign, he has a true conversion to realizing, hey, this is all fun and games, but souls are at risk here. We got to do something for the church. And so he dismisses his mistresses. He gets ordained because he was a lay cardinal. And the way the game worked with the lay cardinals is that you would be a lay cardinal and get in all these church incomes and benefices under you, get as much money as you could under the family purse. And then you would resign from the cardinalate and get married. And then keep all the money that's supposed to be going to pious uses with you and build the basis of various family fortunes. So, and then your kids tonsured and then have him be a cardinal and do the exact same thing over again. This is actually the course that was earmarked for Charles Borromeo by his family.
Interesting.
but he reads the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, and he gets on fire, and that he starts feeding the poor and whatnot. He finds out his family is talking to the Pope. I believe that was Pius IV, to try to get him to get married. He goes out and finds some bishop to ordain him. At the end of that,
The cardinal gets ordained. I just think that's kind of funny.
Yeah, because they were lay cardinals. They were tonsured, and so, but they weren't ordained to the priesthood. They didn't say mass. They weren't deacons or anything of that sort. So that way they keep their options open.
Yeah. What's the legality of a lay cardinal? Is it still a modern concept?
No, they don't do it. Yeah, technically, you could have one because all the cardinals are at the Pope's pleasure. It is service, and so technically you could have one if you wanted to. But I believe it was Pope Paul VI that had set it so that, and there are, as it were, that there were very few lay cardinals in the 20th century. That was a practice that had very much ceased to exist, and I think Paul VI, I'm sorry, did offer it to somebody. I can't recall. And then the person declined because that's not in keeping with Vatican II and the New Spirit, although I don't think it was in keeping before Vatican II either. So anyway, I believe they kind of, it's like a policy. And then they did a rule too: anybody receiving the cardinalate must be consecrated a bishop.
Oh, okay. So,
for example, Cardinal Avery Dulles, who was a Jesuit. I remember I can't remember when he died, but fairly celebrated American Jesuit theologian. Pope John Paul II had made him a cardinal, and so he had to consecrated a bishop right away before he received the cardinalate. So that's kind of the rule they have in place now. So you don't have any more cardinal priests, cardinal deacons the way they did either. But
interesting. The title still exists: cardinal deacon, cardinal priest, right? For other reasons.
You can use it for whatever you wanted to, or and historically a church had a cardinal deacon or a cardinal priest, and so even though you might be a bishop, you're said to be the cardinal deacon of this or that church and what have you.
Gotcha.
So, but Paul III, he gets serious about reform. So as Cardinal Farnese, he just missed his election in the election that brought Giovanni de' Medici in as Clement VII, and who kind of played with the idea of reforming the church, but was never really that serious about it. And so then, and then that's where the disastrous sack of Rome happens. And of course, Cardinal Farnese is in Rome for that when Charles V's soldiery had mutinied because their payment went into arrears. And amidst the army are large corps of what we call Landsknechts, which in German basically means land knight. You see that word connect, and it connects, and you think of the way knight is actually spelled, knight in the Anglo-Saxon, and you see that root in the German still. So any Landsknechts were elite corps of private military companies that would have their own codes, and they were organized by one of Charles V's ministers, Martin von Frusberg. And so they were, originally this corps of mercenaries that ran by their own, units and their own captains, and they would, have their own like system of punishments and awards and whatnot. And they would fight for. At first, they fought for Charles V, but eventually they ended up fighting for whoever could pay them. And as the Reformation carries on, some of them become Lutheran. And so you have several corps that are explicitly Lutheran units of Landsknechts. And so they are in the Charles V's pay. He needs everyone he can get in his wars with the French. Pope Clement VII sided with the wrong side, and he sided with the French in this particular conflict. And the Pope meant to show him this was a very bad idea by putting the army in, a few days' march of Rome. But then the payment, like I said, the payment goes into arrears. They all mutiny and elect a elected general, and then go into Rome, and they take it over and they sack it. The Sacco di Roma, it was 1527, is a horrible bit of destruction and devastation on the city to every level. So Paul III gets elected, and he's in this largely ruined city where there's still rebuilding and so many things going on. But more than anything, he needed the spiritual rebuilding, and he was aware of that. And then the Jesuits show up right then, offering themselves to the Pope.
We're here.
His service, and he's uber impressed with them. It's like, hey, people are doubting the papacy and leaving the church, and you guys are going to do whatever I say. This is incredible. So he has them all ordained to the priesthood, and minus Faber, who already was a priest. and then sets them to work through Italy. And then they start preaching in broken Italian. And the people, take what they need from it. And then just the zeal of these men was such. I mean, just an example of that kind of zeal. Father, what was his name? Jesuit in the 1590s who had gone to Japan, and he'd learned Japanese fluently. So he was interviewing people that actually heard St. Francis Xavier preach. And they said that, and Francis Xavier just has kind of these hackneyed Japanese texts that were put together by someone who knew a dialect of Japanese in one of the islands, but he didn't know the mainland dialect and the concept of certain religious things. He didn't even have the vocabulary to express these concepts in Japanese. And so so these people told this Jesuit father, yeah, we heard Father Francis preach, but we had no idea what he was saying. It's like words were ours, but they didn't make any sense. But we knew that he had to have the truth because he was so on fire that whatever he said was true. And so we were baptized.
That's
So
insane.
Is in a totally alien culture. That's how he's winning his converts to now get to where there's actually understanding something of the broken Italian. And so they the city's renewed. Priests that had concubines, they dismiss their concubines. They start, saying mass actually when they're supposed to say mass.
Whoa.
They have retreats. They start taking, care of the holy places. There's a spiritual renewal in the city that accompanies the coming of the Jesuits. So that's more or less, and they remain, of course, a very small order. There's wrangling over the constitutions that will continue for some time because there's some cardinals that don't like the novelty of certain elements of the Jesuit constitutions. But in, I believe it was 1544, unless I'm mistaken, that the constitutions of the Jesuits were finally approved, and they were now a formal religious order. It might be 1542, I forget. But anyway, so it's all a lot of historical accidents. If it was a different pope there, they might have been, given the boot. But so they found as the Compagnia de Gesù, and when they worked it into Latin, they said because the military company, right? That's what the word compagnia means in Italian, like a military regiment, and that's how Ignatius kind of understood it. So when they try to put it into Latin, they opted for societas because they didn't like the sound, for how they were trying to, how it would literally come into Latin as acies. So the acies Jesu, the column, the company unit of Jesus, it just didn't work right in the sound of it. So they said societatis, the society of, societas is the subject case, the society of Jesus. And so then the term Jesuit gets applied to them. The term Jesuit actually goes from like 100 years earlier.
Interesting.
It was used by those who mocked St. Bernardine of Siena and St. John Capistrano when they established the devotion to the holy name. And they had banners, and so they were called Jesuiteers. It comes out to like Jesus. There's people who are being too free with the holy name. And that's what the original sense of the term was. Somebody who up at a sermon and try to get devotion among the people, which is use the name of Jesus repeatedly, but foolishly and kind of without the proper reverence it gets, right? And so somehow that got applied to the Jesuits because the company used the Compagnia de Gesù, and it just stuck, Jesuitite, and now they stayed as that name just stuck throughout all history.
So an insult attached to the Jesuit or to the society,
like others, that happens frequently. Things like that. Again, even in the early church, I think St. Hilary or St. Athanasius make note of the fact that the word Catholic was used as an insult by the Arians.
oh.
Yeah, we are the universal church. We'll take that.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like it should be an insult, but what do you know what the background, why Catholic was an insult? Why like being universal would be bad?
It mostly because you claim to be this, but we're the wrong universal, if I'm not mistaken.
So irony, or trying to be ironic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They hadn't heard the Alanis Morissette song yet, because that's when everyone started using the word irony incorrectly.
Yeah, makes sense. So that's the birth of the society. It's interesting that it starts sort of in its origin, even though they're, none of the members are English to begin with, but that the story goes all the way back to Henry VIII and just these political machinations that are going on in the background. And, Charles V is one of my, or is one of those leaders that I'm most intrigued by, because he ends his days in, in a monastery and stuff. But just the fact that it starts in England is so interesting. At least the way you started the story starts in England. So after Henry VIII died, then Edward takes over, and then after he dies, Mary Tudor takes over. And this is, I think it's 1560s. Is that, or
No,
1550s?
1552 is when Mary succeeded to the throne.
Yeah.
The attempt to interpose Jane Grey failed. Then then Mary's acknowledged queen 1552.
Gotcha. So how does her reign and her sort of reform or attempted reform of the church in England into sort of a reformative, a more well-ordered church to be destroyed then by Elizabeth, how does that affect the Jesuits?
Initially, it doesn't really affect them at all, because at the time that Mary ascends the throne, the Cardinal Pole arrives back from the continent, and the Council of Trent has its period of pause, and it's going to remain so. So the Jesuits are very busy, working on these types of matters, and the continent. So England itself is largely regarded in the rest of Europe as a backwater. Henry VIII oftentimes is celebrated by English historians for putting it back on the map somewhat, which he did, but that was really through the revolution of the creation of the English Protestant Church against Catholicism. That's the thing where really it goes on the mark. So Mary's England, the Jesuits did not make any type of mission there. They had reestablished Franciscans. They had reestablished, obviously a lot of the monks had not ceased in some of their smaller monasteries, or some were turned out and were privately meeting and whatnot. So now a lot of these were reformed and reset. There is only one point of contact with the Jesuits during this time. So it's a letter that Ignatius of Loyola wrote to Cardinal Pole. And so and Cardinal Pole, never answers it. So a lot of people say, see, they weren't really that zealous for reforming the church. Otherwise, they'd brought the Jesuits in there. And it's good to remember, one, nobody really knew who the Jesuits were. They're still a very young order that was now growing, but there's not a whole lot about it. You had some of the first Jesuits like Diego Lainez and Alfonso Salmeron, and also St. Peter Canisius. They all addressed the Council of Trent at different points, and people were impressed with them, but they were a small little order unknown outside of Italy and a few pockets of Germany. So it now gradually growing. And a lot of people may confuse what Ignatius was specifically offering. He was offering his colleges to help train new recruits for the English mission. And the thing is, this would interfere with projects that Cardinal Pole already had in place, which were to establish an English college in Rome. And the biggest barrier to that was Pope Paul IV, who was half mad and believed there was a heretic under every rock, and especially hated Cardinal Pole, and he wanted him back in Rome so he could burn him for heresy. And he had Cardinal Morone in his dungeon, who was a friend of Cardinal Pole's. And Cardinal Morone, he's the guy who saves the Council of Trent in the next, along with Charles Borromeo and Peter Canisius, right? So he swears on the Holy Scripture that he believes everything that the church believes. And Pope Paul IV is like, not good enough. You're going to stay in jail until I figure out how to come up with a new law so I can burn you. And he especially hated Pole. So there's all the plans that Pole was making to try to establish an English college had to wait, because there's no way Paul IV was ever going to allow that. So Paul IV is one of those interesting cases where there are things he did that in their effect was good, but because of his rigor and severity, they would almost all have been undone if it wasn't for a pope or so later, St. Pius V, who followed Paul IV's reforms that were good and had far more mildness and gentleness in the way he implemented them than Paul IV did. So Paul IV, he did reform various curial offices like the apostolic datary and the various where you got pretty much grants to get out of anything you wanted to get out of if the price was good enough, right? So he switched out the people in there who knew that a swift excommunication would come if they didn't stop every bad practice going on through that office. Or again, any priest that had a concubine or whatever, or wasn't fulfilling his benefice, they were sent to be galley slaves out on in the ships. And then some bishops hanging around looking for favors, he would have them kindly informed. If you happen to have noticed the galleys in the in the Tiber ready to float down with all these priests now rowing them, you can take your place among them rowing unless you get out to where you're supposed to be. So all these were good things. But he was convinced there was a heretic under every last bush. And and that's why when he died, in his administration of the papal government too was so severe. When he dies, the Roman populace revolts and pulls on any statue or image of him in absolute hatred. So
Interesting.
It's so this is the guy that Pool's up against. So Pool never realizes this particular thing, and he had a more long running game in terms of reestablishing the English church. And it was a very vibrant reform, even in those precious few 5 years they had. That when Henry broke away from the church, St. John Fisher is the only bishop that refused to go along with him. And when Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558 and establishes all the articles which go into effect in 59 to restore the church to Protestantism, there's only one bishop that goes along with her. All the others refuse. And likewise, a vast majority of the clergy refuse to switch sides. So, it shows really the credit to Cardinal Poole and the various and the churchmen who had worked so hard for the reform, that so many of the churchmen decided to risk life and limb and income to, defy this change. So it shows that spiritual vibrancy they had. So unfortunately, though, the Jesuits didn't really play any part of that. They come on the scene now as Englishmen depart for the continent, and a good number of them begin showing up in Rome. And so, whereas like under Mary's reign, the only Englishmen were flocking to get back, and the only ones going out were the Marian exiles, or all the hot Protestants that were of Edward VI's mindset, strict Calvinism and everything. So they go to Geneva naturally, and that's where for example, if you see an ad for the Geneva Bible, it's essentially William Tyndale's Bible, the authorized version that they had, with all of Tyndale's notes against monarchs and monarchy and things of this sort. And so the English exiles in Geneva then used that Bible, and that became and they especially used that in resistance to King James in his Bible, which they felt was too popish to, which is kind of funny to hear that.
Yeah.
They actually thought that the King James Bible was too Catholic, and that's why they refused to use. And they thought that James had purposely translated sections to build up the idea of monarchy far more than they were comfortable with. So, but anyway, those are the only ones that hung out in Geneva, or else some of them went vagabonding around Italy, which they could do as long as they behaved themselves. Nobody really cared much, which is actually funny to think of that contrast. You have English Protestants hanging around in Italy. Nobody really minds much. But if a Catholic priest accidentally shipwrecked in Elizabeth's England, they'd put him to death. And they did, actually. That did happen a couple of times.
Yeah. Irony. But it's interesting. It's interesting because the Douay-Rheims Bible seems to be kind of the Catholic version sort of the Tyndale the Geneva Bible. It was written in exile. Right. So it's funny to me that there's a bunch of Englishmen, no matter where they are, no matter what side they're on, they're just translating the Bible because, while they're in exile.
Right.
That's just a hobby for everyone, it seems. But are you familiar with Professor Eamon Duffy?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
I've got several of his books.
Say that again?
Well, I have several of his books, very groundbreaking, especially Stripping of the Altars. And there's a few other ones that are just essential reading, really.
Yeah, he has a great book on Mary's England and the burnings. It's quite interesting just to see how strong really their reform was, because I've also read books where they try, and even Catholic sources who try and tear down the the Marian England reforms as if they were just unpopular and didn't work. Uh, like there's a Jesuit book that is sort of trying to talk, that sort of goes over the Jesuits part in England, starting with Elizabethan England and going forward, and it talks about sort of how the Marian England was backwards and wasn't something to be looked upon for reform, which I thought
And
was
that's not the
interesting.
view on the ground, especially not in 1558 when Mary dies. The view is, even in spite of because they did have very bad plague that year, but the view is generally hopeful for the most part.
Hmm.
Mary's set in a number of things to restore the coinage. They establish map making. Presses are running in England quite a bit now. They're actually printing, new missiles. The Sarah missile. They actually get the means to do that. In England, the financial situation of the treasury is prepped to. The only reason Elizabeth's able to get things going with the coinage and the treasuries because Mary laid the groundwork for all that. The view in general, even in London, which had definitely had more Protestants than any other place in England, was still very hopeful. And here's the other thing too. The burnings were not unpopular, they were just there, and there was felt to be excessive in some degree, but nobody balked at burning a heretic because this was a common practice, or a witch. Especially under Protestants, they really loved those burnings of witches, where in the
Yeah.
Catholic Church, generally more, okay, don't do that again. You really didn't have this thing going out there burning witches and wherever you could find them. So the nature of it, because Calvin had Servetus burned, who was an Anabaptist, and nobody balked at that either, because that's what you did. And the burning a heretic is the sign of what they're going to endure in the next life. So, and sometimes you'd have mercy on them. You take a bag of gunpowder and tie that around their neck, so that. But really, most people and not to say this is a wonderful way to go. It's not. But most people would asphyxiate from the smoke, and so they wouldn't die suffering at the feeling of all this fire on their feet or whatever. So I mean, they'd certainly feel that heat and everything, but they would asphyxiate before any real painful suffering came in from the burning. So not to say that was a wonderful way to go, or that's the way we would want to do it now. Certainly not. But in those times, it was just regarded as standard, as normal. So, but there is the big issue with what about people who were born after Henry had left, or were just like 4 or 5 years old when Henry broke away from Rome? Are they Catholic? And this is a question that it really brings in the canon law and nobody really stops to think about at the time, because some theorists had thought about it, but they didn't know how to deal with it because the crown was pushing so hard for the church to deal with this problem. And I'll get into that in a second. But so when Henry breaks away from Rome, a lot of things seem to go the same, except you have to swear that the Pope has no jurisdiction in England and the Pope is merely just a bishop of Rome. And you have sermons against the Pope's pretended authority in England 4 times a year, maybe 5 times a year, and in other festivals. And the other things mocking and attacking the papal authority. So you basically have not just a schism, but also a heresy, denying that the Pope's authority and the authority of councils and the nature of the church. And that goes on for years. So when Mary comes back to the throne, there's rejoicing. Henricians who'd seen this Edward's reform go way too far, now it's like, okay, we can go back to saying mass. And now it's, well, if we're going to be Catholic again, that's a little bit different, because now we have to accept the Pope's authority, which people were willing to do, but it was like, how? And then you have people that resist it that never really could have been said to be Catholic. So you really can't say they're actually heretics in the sense that the canon laws of the time were written. And nobody's really thinking about it. And the reason is Wyatt's rebellion. So Mary is induced to marry, Charles V's son, Philip, the future king of Spain, and which was a mistake through and through. Certainly Philip felt that way when Philip sets up statues to all of his wives. He had several wives that had died of natural causes. And when he sets up statues to them, the one notably absent was Mary. because he hated and despised his time in England and everything about this whole thing of being a figurehead king in England, a king consort. But nevertheless, the natural English xenophobia comes in. Oh, we can't tolerate this because, he's a foreigner. He doesn't belong here. He's going to be our king consort and stuff like that. That these are new concepts. Mary actually, and here's another thing too. Elizabeth never could have ruled as queen regnant unless Mary had done it first. It just simply, wouldn't happen because Mary is the one who, it's because she has the one thing that Elizabeth certainly did not have that allowed her to trailblaze that path, is that she was sexually pure. She was known to be a virgin. Her life was known to be upright. So that's the biggest thing you have to use against a woman politically in those times. And they did not have, nobody had that weapon at hand, not even the Protestants. So so it was an easy thing for her to ascend. But now you're remaking so many things that were established a certain way. As it was during the War of the Roses, you have, I can't remember her name, tries to rule on the Lancastrian side as a sole queen. Doesn't work. Nobody tolerates it. So, so getting into the nitty gritty. So the Protestants said, okay, with this, we got to move against her now. And they've sensed the national displeasure over having a Spanish king come in, a foreigner coming in. Is one thing if it's like the queen, but now he's going to be the king. So this is like, we can't have that. So what Thomas Wyatt, moves in to try to, and of course, Jane Grey has been kept alive. So they, with her as the figurehead, they revolt and try to get popular support as they're going through. And now, interestingly, too, the English ambassador, Simon Renard, he did not believe, or was it Eustace Chapuis? No, Eustace Chapuis had already retired. So Simon Renard, he did not believe Mary could survive this rebellion. He was making himself very scarce. But in actuality, Mary came out and spoke to the populace in London and explained that, she has this ring, her coronation ring, and this ring is greater in far more, force than her wedding ring will be. Rather, this ring shows that I am wed to the country, to you, my people. And that is the first concern. And she gave such a wonderful speech that people were all moved. So Wyatt gets to London expecting to find the gates open. In fact, people had been bribed to open them. No, the gates are shut. And the troops come in and they wind the whole thing up. So they're executed. Jane Grey, who was the unfortunate victim of the whole thing, she was kind of pushed to prominence by Edward VI as he was dying in order to try to stop Mary from succeeding the throne. Now she's been in the Tower, accepting fully Mary's queenship, right? Not really wanting anything to do with it. She was at home when Edward VI's ministers grabbed her to become queen, just reading Plato in the original Greek. That's rather what she would have been spending her time on. So she gets dragged, so she gets beheaded in this whole thing because the rebellion's in her name and they need to kind of squelch that out. And now Protestantism is a danger because it was a distinctly Protestant rebellion. And the former toleration that they had shown can't be shown anymore.
Yeah.
And this is what
rebellion.
The burnings, and of course they try to put that on the church. Let's make this a heresy matter, and then the church can do it for us. And we work on all these other things. And so that's one of the big problems that comes in. And a lot of the bishops find this very distasteful because they're dealing with people they know are questionable how much that they're heretics and they shouldn't, but they got reported in by someone, so they have to deal with it. And a lot of the bishops are more interested in getting the work of reestablishing the church in order, preaching more, catechizing more, getting more books published. This is the work they want to be doing, not wasting their time inquisiting heretics. And especially when you have people like Stephen Gardner, who was a big part of Henry's break from the church. He goes to see John Fisher with several other bishops, including Bishop Tunstall, who was his friend, and Fisher, because they're like, hey, you're making us look bad by not accepting the act of supremacy. And Fisher, says, alas, the fort is betrayed even by those who should have defended it. But he prays for them and he offers his life for them. And sure enough, every one of those bishops that had gone to see him in this little deputation, they all converted when Mary came to the throne.
Yeah.
They'll come back and profess not just their loyalty to Mary, but that they will be Catholic again. And especially Gardner, who was, one of the worst. But now under Henry's reign, he wrote books defending Henry's break with Rome. So now they would be inquisiting these Protestants, and they say, well, I read in a book by the bishop over there that I don't have to believe in the Pope's authority. Now he says I do have to believe in the Pope's authority. Which is it? It was something that really should have been left alone, but it, in a lot of those types of cases. And so, but the burnings were effective. they were working, right? And more and more, they completely broke the resolve of the strongest Protestants. A lot of them were Unitarians, by the way, whom Elizabeth would have burned, and Edward would have burned, and Henry would have burned. So it's not so like this was unique to Mary. It also doesn't make this wonderful, amazing thing, but within the context of the time, it makes sense. You can understand it. And so there wasn't just a big reaction against it. And even like the epithet Bloody Mary, you don't see that in any contemporary source. You don't see it in Elizabeth's reign. You don't see that phrase appearing until the Seclusion Crisis in the 1670s. And she's remembered largely as Good Queen Mary, even by Protestants, because of the frequent alms that Mary gave in London. Elizabeth's reign chooses to kind of forget Mary, because by forgetting Mary, we're also forgetting that Philip was the king here, and now we're getting ready to make war on him. So you gotta want to forget that part.
Word from our affiliate, Bishop Sheen Rosaries. You've probably worn through the chain of your cheap plastic rosary. Other rosaries simply can't stand up to the wear and tear of everyday life. Bishop Sheen rosaries are made of solid metal beads and paracord to withstand any condition, and are backed with a lifetime warranty. Upgrade your rosary to a Bishop Sheen rosary made to fit your lifestyle, or buy one for a friend. Each rosary sold supplies 2 weeks of food for a school kid in Uganda. You use the exclusive link down below to help support our efforts here at Plotlines. The link will take you to sheenrosaries.com. Be sure to use the code Plotlines10.
It's not till the Seclusion Crisis under King Charles II where this is used, because you had the Fire of London, 1666, destroys most of the city. Charles II is childless by his wife, Catherine of Braganza. And so, and his brother, who is the heir to the throne, James, had become Catholic. So he's a public, out and proud Catholic, came out of the closet of the day, as it were. And the Seclusion Crisis now takes on, where the Whigs are freaking out. We can't have a Catholic king. And so they even write pamphlets about it, referencing the fire. And they said, now when you look upon your city of London, think of new fires lit, the fires of Protestants burning, lit like torches in the night, like the fires under the reign of Bloody Mary. And that's the first time that phrase ever shows up. So that's more or less his creation. It's not a contemporary imagining of her reign. So to put it mildly.
That's interesting. Yeah, I never knew that they would refer to her as Good Queen Mary previously.
Yeah, in general, I mean, certainly not with an over fondness and say Elizabeth's reign, or in James or Charles the first reign, but certainly she was largely forgotten about after that, because the move of Elizabeth is not to throw opprobrium on the family, not attack her older sister in the most recent reign, but simply just to bury it under, and move forward with the program of the new reestablishing Protestantism.
Yeah. So that reign sort of at the fall of Mary, or her death, and the Elizabeth's reign, and then we come eventually to the second sessions of the Council of Trent. What were the goals set up, since the Jesuits were a big part of enforcing what comes from the council?
Well, they certainly were a part of it, but I think not explicitly them as opposed to others. Everybody was. And actually, the first people in charge of implementing what came out of the council were actually monarchs. And it's something we forget today, is that they would have to publish the Reformed Decrees of Trent, and then they would have force of law within the kingdom. And then the bishops would step in to force in, those reforms. And sometimes that was a very complicated and not a very well received thing. So like in Spain, for example, Philip II decided to show his adherence to the council by implementing all the Reformed Decrees of Trent. And then Catherine de Medici over in France, she's looking at this. She's like, wait, all of them? Really? He's employing all of them? Because the French did not. The French dragged their feet on a number of things from Trent. And even Pius V's Bull Quo Primum, which mandated the Roman liturgy as it was then to supplant all local uses of liturgy unless they were 200 years or old or more. The French kings ignored it. They flat out ignored quo primum for until after the French Revolution.
Really? That took that long?
It took that long because that got rid of the old obstacles that were keeping it away. And so that's another we can revisit that when we talk about the suppression. But
sure.
But anyway, same thing with the council. So Philip II goes to implement a lot of the changes, especially in dealing with monasteries. He implements quo primum so that their monasteries using some ritual form similar to all the liturgies were common enough in one way. In another, it wasn't like there was some very unique and different liturgy, like say some of the historic rites, like the Ambrosian rite or the Mozarabic rite or Sarum rite or whatever. It was mostly like you just had certain ceremonies that it began in that church. Nobody knew how old they were. You numbered your Sundays after Pentecost by Sundays after the Trinity rather than Pentecost. You numbered certain things on your calendar differently. You had different readings on certain days. You had different feast days. Some of those were allowed to continue to vary, but a lot of local interest. You hold a candle here and not there. You light a candle at the consecration. These are all sorts of things that were now forbidden, because you had to be using the Roman Missal of 1570. So this is what, which was not a newly created missal, by the way. That's more or less the indistinguishable from the missal used by Gregory the Great, except in a handful of details that had developed over the years. So anyway, so Philip II employs all this stuff, and it puts in all these reform decrees, starts enforcing them. And there's monasteries that won't do it. They refuse to do it. So Philip II sends royal troops in there, and they turn the monks out and lock up the monastery. And one Italian observer described the scene as like Henry VIII's England.
Interesting.
because Philip was enforcing the Council of Trent. So so that's that's the first place. And then bishops would be implementing various reform decrees, and a lot of that touched things that are imperceptible to us now: benefices, absenteeism from a benefice, episcopal absenteeism. That was the scourge of the later Middle Ages. Bishops hanging around in the court of a king or in Rome looking for favors, never administering their diocese. The Diocese of Milan, for example, hadn't had a resident bishop in 120 years. And the last guy who was resident bishop in Milan, St. John Capistrano, had worked with them, I believe. And so here we are, and that there'd been no bishop there. So Charles Borromeo enters the city, and he has to fight too, even against St. Pius V, who wants to keep him in Rome. It's like, no, you appoint me the bishop of the city. I can't live here. I need to, because that's Trent. And Pius V begrudgingly lets him go. And so sends him he goes to Milan, and he prepares the way. He has some Jesuits get in and preach ahead, so retreats and missions in the city for a few weeks. And then he comes in barefoot carrying the cross. First bishop to reside in the city in 125 years. And it threw off the whole political order, because you had the Sforzas, who used to be the kind of the usurped the governorship of Milan at the end of the Renaissance, and then the Spanish, who had taken it from the Sforzas. And so both factions are in the city fighting with each other. Now they get but the church, they more or less split up between them. Priests, oftentimes, because there wasn't enough money to pay them, and there weren't enough benefices for them, because all those benefices are held by the bishop, who's taking that income and living over in Rome, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these guys are part of gangs. They carry guns. They kill people. So and the state of the clergy in Milan was so bad that they used to even have a saying in Milan: "Si vuole andare all'inferno, stare on the pretto." If you want to go to hell, be a priest. That's the saying they had at that time in Milan. Although the dialect, they pronounced it a little bit differently in a few things, but that's the reality of it. So Charles Borromeo sets in to change all of this by actually residing in his diocese, one of the biggest things of Trent. So the Jesuits, in their turn, defended Trent mostly in writing and in print. You see in the writings of, say, St. Robert Bellarmine, when he gets to the sacraments, especially, and other things, that he's following largely the plan of the decrees of Trent and showing their basis in the tradition without even mentioning Trent so much, except to note that the council had taught this, but then to move on to, this is what the Protestants say, but this is what Scripture says, and this is what the Fathers say, and so in his great treatises. And that's largely what the Jesuit role in enforcing Trent was simply its defense both historically, like against writers like Paolo Sarpi, people like that, and in defense of its theological teaching.
Yeah. So on the practical side of the Jesuits, is it common practice, or was it always allowed for Jesuits to be bishops?
In the beginning, part of the constitutions of the Jesuit order, actually, I believe they're still in force. These constitutions were to never accept. One is to never seek a higher office, and you also would vow not to accept a higher office except under obedience, right? And so so right off the bat, no Jesuits. The Jesuit order was basically you became a priest there, and that's all you're going to be is a priest. You're never going to be an authority except in administering the society. You're never going to find a position of prominence in the church. And this is one of the things that brought St. Robert Bellarmine to becoming a Jesuit, because his uncle, Pope Marcellus the second, he died after 30 days of being Pope, and his whole family is celebrating. Everyone's, and he was, a really great reforming prelate too. It was one of those head scratchers when he died, because he was just the guy the church needed, it seemed. But Bellarmine looks at this and he takes a different message. He takes that, well, the papacy is the highest office on earth, to which so many men desire to occupy or control, and yet this man occupied it for 30 days and now he's dead. What is the point? If one wants to save his soul, why does he want to attain high office? And that's the thing too, is like his father didn't want him to become a Jesuit because he wanted him, oh, well, if you become a Dominican, a lot of them become cardinals and then you'll be really important. And his father was a worthy man, but he was very poor. So he was hoping especially to help the family's fortunes. And so, but then Bellarmine had to tell his father that the very reasons he used to persuade me are the very things that caused me to want to be a Jesuit to begin with. I don't want those offices. And that's the way it worked. And that was broken by Cardinal Toledo. I can't remember his full name, but Cardinal Toledo is just known in the literature as Toletus, from the Latinization of his name. And so he was a theologian, and Pope Pius IV, I believe, made him a cardinal. And he said, I must refuse, your Holy Father, because it's against our constitutions and our vows. And then the Pope said, I command you under obedience to take it. And he said, I must first be dispensed by my superior general, which at the time was Father Polanco. And so they networked with together. Polanco contacted the Pope and protested, and the Pope insisted. And so they worked out the general formula that's used, that first once the superior absolved, because the superior is the only one that could absolve you of your oath to not take a higher office. So the superior absolve the oath, then you'll be allowed to receive this particular dignity. And that's what Cardinal Toledo had done. And then the very next cardinal that this would happen would be St. Robert Bellarmine, very much against his will.
Trying to get away from authority.
Right? And it just finds him. He basically occupied almost every single position in the church except that of Pope, which he also was very nearly elected to. He tells in his autobiography that during the conclave of 1605, he was walking back and forth. And 1604, I'm sorry, he's walking back and forth and purposely not meeting with anyone. And the Spanish ambassadors say that the conclave had a mind to elect Bellarmine or Cardinal Baronius as Pope. And so Cardinal Baronius doesn't want it. So he's trying to encourage Bellarmine to go out there and be nice to people so that they'll elect him.
So he doesn't get elected.
And Bellarmine says he's just walking back and forth praying his rosary, saying, Libera mea papatu, deliver me from the papacy, O Lord. And then Baronius is like, come on, you got to go out there, you got to be elected. And Bellarmine stops and he looks at a piece of straw that's on the ground, and he says, do you see that? There was always a lot of mess around, because the way they used to do the conclave then is they come in and they build all these makeshift cells, and carpenters come in building all these little cells and whatnot there where you'd have to sleep the whole time you were there. And
should that be brought back?
Absolutely, it should. Instead of the one bunk Hiltons they've got, they should have to, they can hear every single person in there snoring or whatever. But anyway, so Bellarmine tells Baronius, you see that piece of straw on the floor? If picking it up would make me Pope, it would stay where it lay. And so he definitely did not want that. But Clement VIII threatened to excommunicate him if he wouldn't accept being a cardinal. So the Aquaviva, the general superior, told me how to do it.
Yeah, it's funny how a pope would threaten excommunication somebody to to accept a position as a cardinal.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't put it out that clearly, but he said, of my extreme displeasure, which is read between the lines, I'm going to excommunicate you.
Wow. I'm not sure if would that come from popes, modern popes, such things. That my great displeasure.
If only it would. If only it would. I think it'd be great. There's a lot of people to show it to these days. But anyway,
if just saying you displeased me meant shape up or you'll be excommunicated.
right now, fly right or else.
Yeah, it's a bit scary though.
Yeah, it would be, but I certainly wouldn't want to be hearing that. But anyway,
sure. Yeah. So sort of, they're not supposed to be bishops, but they could be.
Mm-hmm.
And so what was Bellarmine's strategy in enacting the reforms of the council when he was bishop?
When he was bishop, one of the first things he wanted to do was to show to all the priests who were present and the canons and the whatever that he was there as a father, not as and this is another Capua where he was a bishop, was another city where there were hardly any bishops that had resided there for about 100 years or so. And the ones that didn't usually do very much. So Bellarmine's appointment here is kind of funny because it was never intended to happen, but during the controversy on efficacious grace, which broke out between the Jesuits and the Dominicans, the Pope found Bellarmine to be an unwanted critic of his own opinion. And so he decided to get rid of him by making him the bishop in Capua. And Bellarmine's excited about being a bishop because here's an apostolic office that he could do and go back to preaching and doing things instead of the stupid cardinal stuff he had to do, that's how he felt about it. And he says so very much so in letters, which he's terrified that he'll lose his soul by being a cardinal. But now as bishop, he just goes with characteristic aplomb. He gets down there very quickly and starts preaching, not just during Advent and Lent, but every Sunday preaching in the cathedral. And he was one of the most famous preachers when he was younger. So now all the people are like, wow, they're just excited. And Italians, of course, always love to be close to a saint because they're hoping the holiness will rub off on them a little bit. So they flock to it, and so he makes sure preaching is happening all over. Catechizing is very important. So one of the problems with catechizing, though, is when you send priests out, a lot of people aren't going to trust him because of the history of the dreaded Vagus priest, who's the foil of Chaucer and so many others. The Vagus priest is a guy that has been made a priest either through apprenticeship or because he was like the third son in the family, and they threw him in, and they sent him to get ordained, and the bishop just ordained him and never trained him. And so this guy has no income because he can't do anything. And so he'll go through the countryside and offer to the ignorant peasants that he'll do a mass for them if they pay him. And so he'll just do some pig Latin equivalent over a piece of bread and say, oh, I just did a mass, now pay me. So for good reason, people aren't going to trust traveling priests that go around in certain areas. Yeah. This has been a very evil feature of abuse. So Bellarmine gets some of his Jesuit brethren, and he pays all their expenses so that they will ask nothing of the people whatsoever. So they would go out catechizing and teaching, and as they did so, then asking nothing. And so once people saw they weren't asking for anything, then they would come out and listen, and then willingly accept catechism. Bellarmine himself actually catechized young boys. He did so even when he was a cardinal in Rome in the Church of Santa Maria in Via, which he was was his titular church that he was in charge of. He would go down there and teach, whether they were from the noble families or just some bratty kid somewhere on the street corner causing mischief. They'd get them all in there, teaching them catechism. And he always had a way in education. When he was a very young Jesuit, and he was very short. He was about 5 to 5'1". And they sent him up to Piedmont, where the people are much taller, more like 5'10" and 6'1". And so it could be a terrifying thing. A lot of schoolmasters at the time made great use of this line of Proverbs: "Spare the rod, spoil the child," and whippings and beatings were the constant order of the day. And so Bellarmine never did it. Bellarmine never felt the need make use of any kind of corporal punishment for children, because his ways were just winning ways. The fear of displeasing him by bad behavior was such where you would pay attention to learn everything you had to learn from him. And so he ran very efficiently in a number of boys' schools that way. But as bishop now, he seeks to try to, enforce a lot of these different things. He's always in the diocese. He never leaves. The only time he actually leaves the diocese unfortunately was for good. He goes to the conclave that elects Pope Paul V. And of course, Pope Paul V wants him back in Rome. And Bellarmine just says, well, if you're going to do that, you have to provide for my diocese. A bishop will continue my work there and actually live there. That unfortunately doesn't come to fruition. But he had been a father to everyone who was there, down to the poorest person. He felt he had to be in touch with the people. And so he would regularly, he'd go into people's houses like St. John Fisher. In fact, Bellarmine says a lot in his theological writings referencing St. John Fisher. And because St. John Fisher's theological writings, they're still in Latin. They haven't been translated yet, except for one or two of them. But nevertheless, he read Fisher's life, what we now call the life of the early biographer. And he had read that with gusto and took to heart that he should be a bishop after the mind of Fisher. St. Charles Borromeo, likewise, he had a picture of St. John Fisher in his cell alongside with St. Ambrose. Victoria, the founder of the School of Salamanca, has a lot of celebratory things to say about John Fisher and declared him the model of bishops. So this was something that for Bellarmine, it was really big. And, he reads that St. John Fisher would go into the houses of some peasants, no matter, even though his servants could not abide the house because of its smokiness, because the chimney wasn't working right. And he would abide as long as it took, with all this smoke filling up the house, to give a guy last rites and hear his confession. And so this appealed to Bellarmine, and he would hear cases sometimes too. Someone would tell him of a father of 3 girls that's dying, but he won't make his confession because he's so worried about what's going to happen to them. He can't even focus his mind. So Bellarmine goes down to see him directly. And wow. and the man is is sad. He's going to die and leave his wife a widow and his 3 daughters unmarried. And Bellarmine takes his hand and says, "You need not worry about them. I will provide for them on my own, and they will be perfectly safe, and I will find good marriages for them." And the man, lights up, and then he unburdens himself with his final confession, and he dies. And Bellarmine was as good as his word. He provides for the widow, and then he provides for the girls. He becomes basically their ward, and so he has to see to their raising and their education and whatnot. And then he finds marriages for them, which actually, this is a fun prospect, because you would have to go and ask their ward for permission to even court them. So you'd have to go to meet St. Robert Bellarmine and ask him permission to court this girl. Before anything could even begin to go. So, but nevertheless, although those affairs were rather quick in those days. So this would be like a matter of a few weeks, and then she would give her consent, and then they get married. And those all turned out to be very happy marriages. So, yeah. And there's a number of different things associated with St. Robert Bellarmine's very short time as a bishop. Any priest that was in need always knew they could count on him as a father. Any priest that was doing something wrong could expect the full vent of his temper, like the steam rising out of a volcano. And it's actually one thing is St. Robert Bellarmine had a very horrible temper, so much that he had to go to great pains to restrain himself from just blowing up and losing it. And it's actually notable how well he had done that, because in all the writings of his life, those who knew him well could see his face straining, because the anger and the wrath would light up. But there's never one recorded occasion of him completely in some uncharitable fashion just losing it with someone. Yeah. Closest he ever came was when one of his household priests in Capua had met some ladies from the Spanish court and had invited them to come stay with the bishop. And then, then he read the guy the riot act. That I'm not, that I do not allow women to live in my house for any period of time. And so he's wrathful about it. And then he stops. He's like, well, wait a minute. When did you say you invited them? And then the priest tells him the date, and he's like, "Oh, that's perfect. We're saved then." And the priest is confused. He has no idea what just happened. But St. Robert Bellarmine's gift of prophecy came in, which he used a number of times in his life, actually, or exercised anyway, that And he's like, oh yeah, the idea just came into my head, but he was exactly right. In this case, it was because he was going to be in the conclave that elected Pope Paul V. So he knew that. So he wasn't worried about these women, showing up. So he was like, phew, safe.
That's funny. Yeah. It also reminds me a little bit of Saint Nicholas with the virgins, giving the money to the virgins so they didn't have to become like prostitutes.
Right.
I mean, I would say, I'm guessing there's more to that story that we just don't know, like more of the Bellarmine taking care of, looking out for those girls and finding the marriages. Like that seems almost like the full story in some ways.
It's
To
related
the
to canonization documents, and then that's where I found that story. And there's other ones. Bellarmine's first English language biographer, James Broderick, he includes a number of stories about that, including his mania for giving alms, which was another one. He always had a mania for giving alms, and which was something at his mother. He inherited from his mother for sure. So it was like he took his cardinal's ring and he would pawn it. He'd give it to someone to go pawn it, and which would be a huge scandal if anyone found out. So then he would go back to the pawnbroker, and he'd get the ring back. And then, so if ever he was in some situation where he didn't have any money on him, and then he would say, now go find this pawnbroker in the Via della Scrofa, and he'll give you what you need. And then he'd go back and pay the guy and get it back, and so on and so forth.
That's funny. Yeah, that I feel like that would be almost scandalizing at some points if it
Yeah.
was found out about at the time.
Especially in those times, but
Yeah. So what Bellarmine is also connected to the Galileo controversy.
right.
How so? What is the story behind his interactions with Galileo?
In 1616, Galileo appears at the Roman college, and he's feasted and wined and dined, and talks about various of his discoveries, and not least of which is, of course, the Dutch spyglass, which has given him this ability to observe, things that were scarcely observed before. So one of the there's all kinds of myths that surround the whole thing. So just to try to dispel them and quickly, he's welcomed by the Jesuits, and like I said, wined and dined. And there's things he has that challenge various notions out of Aristotle or ancient Greek science. And so the one of those, the one they always run with on like history documentaries and things, is that, oh, Galileo showed the moon wasn't a pure luminous body, which was church doctrine. No, it isn't. Where do you get that? Galileo had showed craters on the moon. These things had been observed on the moon before, and you can observe them with the naked eye to a certain extent. So, and there is no church doctrine that the moon was a pure luminous body. But nevertheless, there were certain things about the moon and the nature of craters. And Bellarmine was curious about them. So he wrote to his friend Christopher Clavius, who was a Jesuit mathematician of worldwide renown. And he was the one who came up with made the calculations necessary to affect the new calendar, which Pope Gregory XIII promulgated. That's why we call it the Gregorian calendar, which we still use it today. And Clavius has a couple of areas on the moon named after him, and so on and so forth. So and that's largely who, and he's interested by Galileo and very receptive of a lot of things Galileo has to say. So the Dutch spyglass deserves mentioning, because Galileo actually did not make that. He did not grind away the glass in some Venetian glassmaker's shop with a cannonball, but he had someone else do it. And so there's always like a kernel of truth. Galileo is one of these big charlatans. He is an expert mathematician without a doubt. And he's a very sharp, very witty individual, but he's always got to do things. So like in the Pisa experiment, for example, right? Which he was correct about. He measures the time that the rocks fall in decimals, and that's just him adding his little mathematical flair to show I'm so much smarter than. There was no device that existed that could have recorded speed, a time in decimals. It just didn't exist. Decimals were basically a mathematical flourish to, like we talk all the time, well, yeah, 0.01 seconds, right? because we get drilled in math and for so many years, and so our expressions, will make use of decimals to express how much we dislike or do like, or the lowest possible chances of of this or that happening, right? Well, in those times that didn't exist in the public speech, talked about decimals. That's mathematicians' language. So he adds that little flair in there just to show him so much smarter than everyone else here. And and he does other bits of that. He plagiarizes shamelessly. All of his notions on physical force and physical motion are plagiarized from a 14th century monk named Jean Bourdon. And he had, come up with a lot of different ideas. So Galileo plagiarizes all of them, gives no attribution. He plagiarizes Kepler and gives Kepler no attribution. And which is really stinging for Kepler, because Kepler comes in, he succeeds Tycho Brahe. And Tycho Brahe, who is a Danish astronomer in the court of Rudolf II, the Holy Roman Emperor, it was basically, his job as astronomer is to cast the horoscope, which was more than just a fun joke in the newspaper like it is today. Astrology was taken very seriously by a lot of people. And astrology, it's basically a false science that yields a true science, namely astronomy, because all the work and the mathematical calculations and the study of the stars and heavens, all that is necessary to do astrology. But then that knowledge about it got aggregated into a true science. Sort of like alchemy. You look at alchemist tools and the knowledge an alchemist has to have. It's all the same things as a chemist. It's all the same. But the focus and ideas are completely different. An alchemist is trying to transmute base metals into gold, to find the philosopher's stone that will allow this transformation to happen. And to get anywhere near that, they have to learn all about the properties of metals and elements and all these things. And that furnishes a true science, namely chemistry, instead of the false one, which is alchemy. So anyway, so when it went back to astronomy and Galileo, so Kepler comes in and Tycho Brahe put forward a model that solved a lot of the problems better than Copernicus had in terms of things you observe and whatnot, because Copernicus keeps the ancient Greek notion of perfect circular orbits and planets that don't seem to follow this, that seem to go out here. He postulates an epicycle. It's moving. There are more circles, right? Because that's what the Greeks have postulated. The circle is the perfect shape. So when you see something that doesn't add up, it's because this heavenly body goes in another circle. More circles, because those are perfect shapes, and those are the only shapes you'll have in heaven. That's kind of the idea in the ancient Greek philosophy on the thing. So Copernicus keeps all that. Tycho Brahe throws it out. He postulates instead the Earth in the center, and then the sun and all the planets orbiting the sun go around the Earth. And the calculations, actually that model, if you run that model today, it will still explain the kind of things you see in the solar system, FYI. And that's because the math is right. So Kepler has an opposite view. He says, no, the sun, is because he follows the notion of Copernicus, switch out the place of the Earth for the sun. So the sun is the center, and he's got all of Tycho Brahe's calculations, but he can't make it work with this system. So he goes back to redo all the calculations. In other words, he does the work. And he goes back, he observes things on the very same day that Tycho Brahe observes them. He observed them. He takes all this, all that data as his guide, and he is able to make the calculations for coming up with the model, which largely is the model we use today, right? Mm-hmm. So now Galileo reads all of his work and he plagiarizes it, and he claims he discovered all this stuff, which of course is again false. He hadn't. So now he comes postulating on the question of the Earth's motion and the sun at the Roman College, and he's listened to very eagerly, by the way, because Copernicus, don't forget, published Revolutionibus. He dedicated it to Pope Paul III. So this wasn't something that the church said is a big no-no. It's because it basically was of mathematicians' interest, and it sat as something that could be legitimately debated. Jean Bourdon, a few centuries earlier, we mentioned him in terms of physical motion. He lays out various arguments in his time in favor of the Earth going around the sun, and then he rejects them in favor of the tradition. But he postulates the arguments, and nobody burned him for doing that because it was an open question as far as anyone was concerned. So Galileo, forces it, and then he meets with some well-informed criticism from various Jesuit scientists, and it's in 1617, and he doesn't like it. So he sets out to prove from Scripture that the earth moves and goes around the sun. So he reinterprets Joshua 10, where Joshua holds up the staff of Moses and holds up his arms, and the earth itself stood, the sun and the moon, they stood still, keeping the day going. As long as the day was up, the Israelites were winning. And so Galileo goes to reinterpret this to try to prove instead that the earth goes around the sun. And this is what gets him into trouble. It has nothing at all to do with the question of heliocentrism versus geocentrism. It's rather that Galileo was teaching scripture without a license. He lacked and this controversy brings in people on various sides now trying to weaponize scripture and deal with quotes in the fathers that seem to teach against it. So you get like a Carmelite, Foscarini, who's very who's convinced that in the Earth's movement and that the sun, the Earth goes around the sun. You have other things. And Bellarmine's an old man at this point. He's almost 80. And he's only 3 years away from death while this is all going on. But he's also technically in charge of the Holy Office. So he's got to deal with this problem. And he's convinced that the church, that the fathers are unanimous on this question, that the earth does not move and everything goes around the earth. So how to deal with this new problem? And principally what happens is that the Pope puts it, they have a trial in 1618 on this subject, and which deals with Galileo's. So Galileo is solemnly held not to teach scripture unless he has acquired the right, license, and not to teach on matters of concerning anything in the faith, without being so licensed. And he's held not to teach and not to assert heliocentrism as anything more than an opinion. As long as he dealt with it as an opinion and they were balanced, he would still be allowed to do that. And what he was condemned for was it was declared an error in faith to say that Joshua 10 teaches that that the earth goes around the sun. Not the whole doctrine itself that the earth goes around the sun is condemned, just that to teach the scripture says was declared to be erroneous. So, and that's shown by the fact that it still leaves room for Galileo to teach heliocentrism as long as he leaves it as an opinion. And then there you are. So then people are kind of rumoring on the street that Galileo was condemned. And he goes to Bellarmine and he says, you've always dealt with me so very kindly. People are saying I'm condemned, but if I understood right, I'm not condemned. I'm only, barred from teaching on scripture. And he said, that's correct. So Galileo asked Bellarmine to write him a note, basically summarizing the findings of the Inquisition, that he was not allowed, that he was not condemned as such, but only condemned for the teaching of scripture without a license. And he has that, and he actually produces this letter at the second trial in 1635, long after Bellarmine dies. Bellarmine dies in 1621. So so that's the first trial, the beginning of Galileo's troubles. And then he goes on quiet, peaceful for a while until again in the middle of the 1620s, he makes a big misstep. So he decides to bring the challenge again. He thinks he's fortified himself with new arguments and new observations that are going to prove his case. So he publishes the Dialogue of the World Systems. And in that book, he makes the Pope look like an idiot and a buffoon. And one thing he didn't think about is the Pope at the time, he may not put two and two together, or he might have just been planning to go this way. I don't know. But the Pope was Maffeo Barberini, Cardinal Barberini, now as Urban VIII, formerly patron and friend of Galileo, formerly had funded Galileo in various projects of his. So now he feels personally betrayed by Galileo because of the publication of this book. So, of course, it violates what his trial said in 1618, because he's asserting as true rather than treating it as a proper opinion. And so he's mad, and he tells the Jesuits to take the thumb screws off and go after him. And that begins the long process. It culminates in Galileo's second trial, which has a good bit of chicanery in it. And certainly Galileo was never tortured. He was never thrown into a deep, dark, leaky dungeon. He was living in a palatial villa and given like all the pen and paper at no expense to write with. That's expensive stuff in those days.
Sounds great from my perspective.
Yeah, I know. Please give that to me. What can I deny that you'll lock me up in a villa like that?
Make me Galileo.
Yeah, right. And the thing about Galileo too, and everyone who studies physics today knows this, is that every argument that Galileo had brought before the church was invalid, but scientifically. even by the standards of the time, it was somewhat tenuous. And so Galileo simply could not prove what he was asserting as a fact, and yet challenging what had been taught through scripture and the fathers. So this is why, again, he gets condemned and he gets in this trouble and that controversy, now like forever be the go-to for atheist agnostics, much like the burning of Giordano Bruno is another one they love to go to just more fuel for that fire in the 19th and 20th centuries. It'd be better if the whole thing never happened, but there we are.
Yeah. So at this point, it seems like the society has grown by the time of Galileo's second trial. It's very prominent. Is that the
Yes.
case?
By the 1570s, the Jesuits had become so ubiquitous throughout the Christian world and also in mission lands abroad that they had more or less taken their place in the imagination of younger people as among the great orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans and Benedictines, and the Jesuits were now seen as being just a commonplace in the life of the church as they are. And so that's the kind of the nature of it. And their missionary work as well has expanded, and they do a lot of things over there. Also gets them in a bit of trouble here and there. But they go for an extreme enculturation. That is that, and it's something Francis Xavier discovers in Japan largely. That when he's like, we assume that these cultures are like us and they respect poverty, and just like we do, and that there's no king or that wouldn't look upon a poor man and be moved to pity. And and showing ourselves poor is our strength. But in this part of the world, it's a weakness. They don't see that. They just see a poor beggar. And in the caste system, nobody who's a poor beggar could possibly be sent from heaven. And that's the way these people are. That's the way they're hardwired. So we need to turn this around. So he takes off his tattered cassock. He puts on his best cassock, and he goes in the presence of one of the daimyo and preaches, and he receives the faith. And now he has a lot of success, and he's making a lot more converts. And this is something that he put together his experience in India too, where none of the the Indian the terms are, I can call it Buddhism to my mind, but I can't call it Hinduism to my mind and get the terms for their thinkers, but they're Brahmins. That's right. So the Brahmins especially, they look at a poor beggar. There's no way he's sent from heaven. It's just not happening. So Francis Xavier kind of lays down this new course, right, of sort of an enculturation, of taking on these customs to make the gospel more palatable to them, to seem less foreign and less alien to them. Francis Xavier himself his going there was kind of by accident. King John III of Portugal had asked Ignatius for a couple of his men to do mission work in India, principally because the Portuguese had fought with the Turks and other empires out in the east. They had defeated them. The great general Albuquerque had defeated them, and then conquered good bits of Goa, of South India. So now the problem was that the Portuguese kind of came through, gave drive-by baptisms, and now moved on. And nobody's being instructed in the faith. Nobody's really living the faith. And the Portuguese themselves are abusing this new people and practically enslaving them. So we need somebody to shake them up, shake things up over here, and whip everyone back into shape and make them true Christians. And so one of the original Jesuits, Bombadilla, I can't remember his first name, a Spaniard, he got sick, very, very ill. And so he could not. Jesuits were always in hospitals, always in these places working with people that were plague stricken and at death's door. And so he got ill in the course of this. So Ignatius had to sacrifice one of his best men and closest friends and say, okay, I need you to go to India, knowing he'd probably never see him again. Yeah. So that's exactly what, and plus he was a perfect candidate because he spoke Portuguese as well as French. And so he gets sent off. And so and starts doing the rest of his work in India, and that lays the foundation for all future Jesuit missions. He dies looking at China, not able to get in, but then future generations of the Jesuits would get to China and be a lasting influence on China. And if anyone wants to know more about that, my friend Dr. Anthony Clark, he's written several books on the church in China. It deals with the Jesuit role there, and I'd recommend those. But So it's gotten to be so by 1635, it's a very big order. It's in every country. It's also aroused massive suspicion in Protestant countries. Jesuits are now the foil of many Protestant jokes, conspiracy theories, pamphlets, etc. So it's there. It's a very powerful order.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what made them sort of have that missionary spirit? What element of the order drove them to go from sort of this group, this mainly in Europe, in helping out with the reforms and the defense of the Council of Trent, to really going out there to these new lands?
Principally, it's the very founding spirit of the order. Ignatius had been foiled once in preaching to the Turks in Jerusalem, hoping to gain a martyrdom. So he went and he got 9 more people to share in the same vision and to do the same thing. And then they were again prevented, this time by war with the Turks, by the major powers. So the idea is, well, if our mission is in Europe, or a mission is in mission territory, it doesn't matter. It's still missionary work everywhere we go. In every single province. So between of all the founders, especially Ignatius and Francis Xavier, Francis Xavier's goal is to conquer the whole world, right? But for Christ now, instead of for cosmopolitan virtues. And Ignatius's goal is to preach everywhere, to make everything his mission. And so every province of human knowledge is the goal. And that's why you see the Jesuits so prominent in the sciences, and you see them so prominent in theology, and you see them so prominent in virtually, there's not a single field of human inquiry that doesn't have a Jesuit involved. There's not a single land upon the face of the earth that once known a Jesuit hadn't tried to get to in order to preach the faith and make more converts for Christ. So so that missionary spirit it's very much, that's what the order is all about, really. Wherever you go is your mission.
Yeah, I can see why that sort of, there is that element of fear within people that don't understand the Jesuits, make up stories about the Jesuits, Protestants making them the butt of jokes, and just spreading fear, because it almost seems like they suddenly have become everywhere.
Mhm.
And any growth of an order, I think, can be daunting, even within the church.
Mhm.
But yeah. So what was their sort of school of theological thought historically? Where were they Thomists? Were they more Franciscan in their manner of thought? Did they have their own school?
A bit of the first and the last. So they were Thomists specifically, and followed St. Thomas on many things. The 16th century was one where you didn't really have movements, and you didn't really have, currents of thought, and people were, you didn't have like a thinker that would be like considered a guru. We can't go against what he thinks. And so you'd have no problem, criticizing even St. Thomas if you felt the need, if you thought he was wrong on something. So for the Jesuits, it was very much being their own man, and part of it comes from the Parisian style of teaching that they learned at the Sorbonne, that they then enshrined in the Roman College in Rome. So they had established a Ratio Studiorum, which is actually one of the most important works in the history of the order. Bellarmine was involved in that, so was Suarez and Mariana and various other, Cardinal Toledo, other famous Jesuits. And so the principle was always, of course, Aristotle and St. Thomas, and they were their guides as they went about. So you could loosely call them Thomists. There are many things that Thomists would agree with, but Suarez, for example, he has a system of interpretation of St. Thomas, and a lot of Jesuits tended to follow that, say like Bernard Lessius or Azor, various other Jesuit theologians could be said to follow Suarez's kind of notion. And Suarez does get some things wrong in St. Thomas, without a doubt, or takes a very different view on other things. But there's some places I remember I was reading Suarez, and it seemed like he didn't really understand what St. Thomas was getting at in a certain section. So these are, the general currents in terms of, how the society worked. And basically it was to, do the very same thing Thomas had done, which is to, in the inquiry of truth, you make use of everything that's true, and not reject something merely because someone else had said it. And you're trying to get to that, that true information. So you go through all your sources, you put all these things together, with the guiding light, of course, of the fathers and the medievals. We stand on the back of everything that's come before, and that, I mean, that can really be said of any good theologian too. So in Eterne Patris, Leo XIII, when he talks about restoring Christian Thomism, although his notion of what he's doing at the time is guided by his longtime teacher, Joseph Kloitkin, and Kloitkin is establishing basically what today we call Neo-Thomism. And but Leo XIII still mentions people like Suarez as instances of Thomism, something that if you ask a Thomist today, they're going to vehemently deny it. Suarez is a really serious Thomist. So there's lots of different things to be said there, on a number of different points, but in general, that certainly is something that characterizes the Jesuit thinking. Another thing is a doctrine of moral theology called probabilism, and that's traced out a little bit in some of the translations I've done of St. Alphonsus Liguori, because he follows probabilism as far as he sees it useful. And what probabilism is that it sometimes is described as giving the penitent the benefit of the doubt, but it's said if an opinion on some moral matter is simply probable, then you may follow that. It doesn't have to be absolutely certain, as long as that probability is well established. So you got like a choice of action, say like on a contract or some other moral matter. Can I go through this contract? It's probable I can, and so therefore I can do it. I don't have to be absolutely certain. That's essentially the doctrine of probabilism. And then there's other examples, probabiliorism, which uses that Latin comparative. So more probable, it has to be the more probable opinion. That's something that St. Alphonsus rejects, among others. And so so that's one like characteristic of the Jesuits in moral theology. And so criticism of the Jesuits on those points would be from other thinkers, Catholic too. He would say that actually that's very Jesuitical of you, right? Trying to find all the loopholes to get you out of sin is how it was characterized. And there certainly were some Jesuit authors that could be said to have done that. You have the famous case of Pascal, the philosopher Pascal, fighting against various Jesuit writers. The Jesuit writers in moral theology were what they called casuists. And you had casuistry, and that literally is from the Latin word for case by case basis. They start employing various principles to say, now in this case, and so that the criticism is you're creating all these elaborate cases that you could just look at and say, okay, so in this case you do this. And so, and some of it was really pretentious or just dry or just unimpressive. And some of it was really good. So St. Alphonsus Liguori takes the work of a Jesuit, Henry Busenbaum, and he begins making commentary notes on that for his order in the 18th century. And as he, again, he continues laboring on it, and he runs into new questions. And so now, before you know it, it's increasing. And now, it's like he's got his own commentary built into everything Busenbaum has said. And so that's basically the essence of St. Alphonsus's moral theology. There's some places where it's just his own treatise, and he's dealing with the problem, but really, it's that's kind of what St. Alphonsus does. It makes it great. It took the best things the Jesuits had done, and he makes it a lot better. So there's other areas we could talk certainly about the Jesuits, but what characterizes their, like I said, generally in philosophy, they follow Aristotle and Thomas as guides as they kind of work out their own way. Politically, they're known for the doctrine of popular sovereignty in terms of as the proximate authority for a ruler's governance. That proximate, he comes from the proximate source of the people, right? And that at least in some way, at least tacitly consent to his rule, whereas God is the ultimate source of all authority. So that's one point. And then another one that Jesuits were often noted for was the doctrine of tyrannicide. and this is largely Mariana, because Mariana is quasi-anarchic in some of his thoughts, which I heavily approve of myself. But beside that, his idea is a community can choose to withdraw. This is the Jesuit Mariana. He says that a community can choose to remove itself from a monarch's rule if he's a tyrant, or if they simply find his rule disadvantageous. That is, they can set up their own, commonwealth of sorts and just immediately get out. And that was something unique to Mariana. It doesn't have a whole lot of support in the tradition. Bellarmine certainly didn't support that. But nevertheless, and he also held that, if a king is a tyrant, then the men of the realm can go and kill him. Now, St. Thomas had actually taught the same thing, by the way. But the Jesuits get tagged with it now, and especially as the murky conspiracy theories, like the gunpowder plot is another one. It's state-sponsored terrorism meant to ensnare as many Catholics as possible, and the Jesuits especially. And and so for years, of course, alleged that the Jesuits were involved in the gunpowder plot. Or again, you have like various other pamphlets detailing the Jesuits' plan to take over and rule the entire world, and things of that sort. And so the tyrannicide element plays into the fact that because Mariana had written on these subjects, every Jesuit's out there waiting to assassinate the monarch, and the rhetoric too under Elizabeth. They believe that Pius V was ordering the Jesuits to assassinate Elizabeth, and which is absolutely not true at all. So.
Yeah, makes sense. It's very interesting. Why were the Jesuits all male? Why are they still all male?
The idea of having nuns, having a convent of sisters, never really, it's not anything that ever, came to mind to Ignatius's mind. And over the years, it's the spirit and the notion of the Jesuit order. It was basically to, excel at all this mission work and to excel in every field you go into for the greater glory of God. So it's all, Ignatius is not a particularly bright and experienced theologian, but he is a brilliant administrator. So he knows how to manage people and make the best use of those who join the order, right? And so then that spirit, and the kind of the governance goes on. The focus is who I've got at hand. So the idea of having a convent and managing them and taking care of them, this is something that they're kind of like, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure we want to be getting into this. It as it was, and there's all kinds of jokes in the time about dealing with nuns, because it's a complicated thing. Really, it used to be that a new priest was only allowed to hear the confessions of men. He was not allowed to hear the confessions of women until he was more spiritually advanced, and of course had training, because they recognized even back then that women's psychology is more complicated than men's, and a priest that wasn't trained in how to properly manage them could do something lead them really wrong. And so you had to have a couple of years, but in order to be a confessor for nuns, you had to be hearing confessions for 20 years, or they wouldn't let you do it.
Oh, wow.
And so because nuns in it, so if women are more complicated psychologically and physiologically than men are, nuns are far more complicated than male religious orders. And so if somebody ever suggested, hey, why don't we have a foundation of Ignatian sisters, I'm sure that it was like, yeah, we don't want to get into that. We don't have a death wish. But really, and jokes aside, properly managing the spiritual guidance of a group of women, it is because of the unique challenges that women bring, because of the complex makeup they have, which God gave them for the right ends, and it tends toward their virtue and their glory when it's managed all correctly. Getting to there, especially today, it's a lot harder. But even back then too, where men really didn't understand women. You have or filled with kind of general notions of things that and then you get into a convent. If the priest didn't have the experience, he's going to lead these sisters wrong, because for a nun, especially for a woman, getting closer to God, there's a complicated things in the female psychology that you have to direct yourself through. And you can notice that if you read Saint Teresa of Avila's writings in her spiritual things, she's a woman writing for women. And you read that compared to St. Francois de Sales, that is Francis de Sales, for, say, In the Love of God, where he's addressing a man. Little bit different in the approach and the notions of things. And Francois de Sales directed both monks and nuns, and so he knew part of those struggles and those trials. So that's why so it's not any kind of discrimination against women, or not trying to fall into stereotypes about women. I mean, no, man. Right? It's my wife and I will joke about things like that, but really truly there is a difference, and a difference has to be noticed, and so that's why they had rules like that in place. I mean, 20 years experience, hopefully you're ready to take on the challenge of a convent. So
Yeah. Is that was that 20 years also for just hearing any woman's confession?
I don't know. I'd have to check on that. Like, I've seen some canonical regulations about it. I can't remember exactly when they say, but I think it usually was 20 years experience as a confessor was what it was said. But I'm not sure. It'd be if it wasn't for the shortage of priests in the church, it would be a salient rule to bring back, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be impossible at the moment. But yeah. So let's fast forward a little bit to the suppression of the Jesuits. Can you give us an idea of what that was like?
We can draw together many things we've already touched upon. So you have various conspiracy theories, like we said, which are not always wrong. Sometimes the Jesuits were running political missions, but the fear on one side, the love on the other, and they made one of their areas of mission activity the rich. We got to convert the rich, especially if we're going to get funding for all the stuff we want to do. So they would work with rich people that tutor their children. Voltaire, even the great enemy of the faith in France, he actually has Jesuits teach his son. Because it's like weird. You want an intellectual equal. You don't get some Huguenot. You don't get you need a Jesuit if you want to have your son trained as a brilliant mind and everything. And so Voltaire actually kept him at his household. They had they had schools, they had missions, they had universities, they had departments in more established universities that they ran. They had the very first Jesuit university, actually, outside of the Roman College itself, was actually run by St. Robert Bellarmine in Leuven in Belgium. They had, the Jesuits had established a faculty there, and Bellarmine actually became the first to break from the scholastic tradition of the sentences of Peter Lombard to instead studying the Summa Theologiae of St. Thomas Aquinas. So that was the first time that outside of a Dominican house of studies or something that had been done. Even for the Dominicans, you still learned the Magister, that is Peter Lombard. You learned his sentences first and then commented on them. And that's how you got your doctorate. And now Bellarmine threw that completely out of order, at least where the Jesuits were concerned. You're going to read Thomas Aquinas. And that partly becomes standardized in the Ratio Studiorum. So, but anyway, you have this, there's a general sense of the Jesuits have too much power. They even joke about the head of the Jesuit order being the Black Pope, because he wears a cassock and he's as powerful, at least, as the Pope, as some would say. Or again, because some of the situations are different. So Louis XV, for example, in France, was favorable to the Jesuits early on. But then as time goes, he's put into some difficult positions. One being that his mistress, Madame Pompadour, the Jesuits won't let her off on her lifestyle. They've been vocal critics of her. So she hates them. And then on the other side, because of the financial troubles Louis XV has been in, he's forced to work closer with the various parliaments in France. And of course, they're anti-Jesuit very strongly. And so that pushes the crown in France toward this anti-Jesuit feeling. Then you've got in Spain also, where the Jesuits were born. It was like, well, they were there for that time, but now there's again fear in the Spanish crown, which is also at this time related to the French house of the Bourbons. They're worried about the power of the Jesuits, and they'd kind of like the Jesuits out of their way. In Portugal, the Jesuits are completely expelled from the country because they're blamed for an assassination attempt on the king, using the rhetoric of, well, they technically teach tyrannicide's okay, So therefore, they were responsible for this assassination attempt on the king. Not exactly winning logic, they didn't go to a Jesuit school, I imagine, but but still, it's and so in general, there is this kind of fear of the power that they have, and the fact that they are involved in political things. Basically, it's also envy. They've achieved too much, and you look at the amazing things they've achieved all over Europe and in the missions abroad and so many things. So what happens finally that causes the break is that the monarchs have a veto power over whoever would be elected pope, and so they could threaten to use that. This is conceded in ancient times, so they threaten to use that. Then you have the politicking that goes on between their representatives there, that is various cardinals from different countries that agree to represent their king's interests. So they're politicking in the conclave for someone that will suppress the Jesuits, and so they finally settle on someone who might be the one to do it, Cardinal Gangalini, I think, right? Ganganelli, Cardinal Ganganelli. So takes the name Clement XIV, and he agrees to this privately, but now he's like, I really don't want to do it. This just seems wrong to me. And he wasn't terribly, well disposed toward the Jesuits, or well disposed against them, or very much determined against them. But the pressure kept on building, especially from Spain, and they sent ambassadors there, would force this promise out of him, threatening various things if it wouldn't be done. But it's interesting too that at the same time, it's like a campaign slogan that suddenly appears out of nowhere, as if long prepared, of why the Jesuits need to be suppressed, and it's being called for by every head of state in Europe except for two: Catherine the Great of Russia and the William of Prussia. They want the Jesuits there because the Jesuits are building educational institutions.
So non-Catholic countries.
Yep. And that's actually ultimately how they survive. So eventually all the powers that shouldn't be lean upon Clement XIV to suppress the Jesuits. And eventually then he writes his bull suppressing them, valid now and in perpetuity, he says. And so the only places it didn't happen is in Prussia and in Russia, because they refused to publish the bull, which means it didn't become law there. So the Jesuit order continued. Eventually, the Prussians did suppress the Jesuits during the Napoleonic Wars, but in Russia, they never did. So so that's where they had continued. But that's kind of the nature of the political pressure that led into the suppression. And there's a lot more to it. And to get into it, but several more hours worth to get into. But interestingly enough, though, so when the suppression happens, there's a few places where it doesn't. So one is in Geneva, in the valleys where Saint Francois de Sales had worked, energetically bringing people back to the faith. The Jesuits were the only ones who dared to oppose, the Calvinists and preach and teach there and say mass there. No other clergy would go in, as they were afraid of being killed. So when the suppression came, they wrote to Rome and they said, we will obey, but for the salvation of souls, we need to continue here until you send us a replacement. Once you send us replacements, we'll obey the suppression and report to a bishop. Nothing ever happened. They continued. And it was left alone. And again, too, there was another guy who refused to acknowledge the suppression at all, and he declared himself the Jesuit superior general and had fortified the Jesuit superior mother house in Rome so that it continued to operate. And it continued right under the Pope's nose. Pope did nothing about it.
How long did that last?
Through the entire period of the suppression.
Oh.
Not too many guys were hanging out in there, but nevertheless, they'd still try to maintain the presence of a Jesuit order in Rome, in spite of all that. But everywhere else, they were suppressed, and so either they would go to go under bishops. They would sometimes they joined other orders. Sometimes they would set up as mission priests, here and there, and it just depended on the circumstance for each priest and what was going on. But so that's how the suppression happened. So that continued until 1821, I believe, or was it a little earlier?
Yeah,
but during
I'm not sure.
French Revolution.
Sorry, I have a question.
Sure.
It was the Archbishop of Paris, I believe, at the time of the suppression, that basically said that this was bad, so I'm not going to listen. Is that what the Is that what happened?
I don't recall specifically, but eventually it was carried out in Paris, because then the in the lead up to the French Revolution, because like when you see people who are the various priests who were hacked to death and martyred by the sans-culottes during the
mhm.
revolution, you'll have mentioned was once a Jesuit, was formerly a Jesuit. And so it seems that a number of them stayed together and continued working, even though legally they were no longer Jesuits. So uh,
Gotcha.
that seems to be how it worked. So the and so the nature of that suppression, so it was supposed to be like forever, that's what the bull says, but legal fictions like that's just canonical buzzwords for, and when you see that phrase valid now in perpetuity, you can't make a law that binds somebody with equal power now and in perpetuity. It's a legal buzz phrase, it's a technical term to reflect two things. One, to reflect the notion that we get from the ancients that a law should be as perfect as it possibly can, until a better and more efficient law can come in and replace it. And two, law should have a basic notion of permanency. That if there's no reason to replace it, there's no reason to replace it. And constantly having new laws and changing the law every couple of years makes people less and less apt to obey the law, or want to obey the law, or even know there is a law, and
Hmm.
so it increases the injustices. So that phrase is basically representative of those things. And usually whenever you read that phrase, that means you're reading a legal document, not some theological document. So and that's especially you see the case here, it was valid now and in perpetuity, or for about 50 years. It's but anyway, so after the Napoleonic Wars, there's several chances where say that the French episcopacy, Napoleon basically gives them, you can go into schism and I will support you. Now, he doesn't put it that way. It's like, hey, you guys wanted a Gallican church? I'll give you a Gallican church. The Pope's not playing ball with me. You can be your own church, right? You'll be my national French church. And the bishops pause, because even though there are a number of former Gallicans among them, that certainly would have wanted that. It's like, hey, we went through all the travails of the French Revolution. We tasted real schism and real ecclesiastical anarchy. We don't want to deal with that again. We don't want to do anything that even comes close to it. So they refused. They told Napoleon, no, we will not create the Gallican church for you. You'll release the Pope and we'll obey him, which ticked him off, but he was on his way to Russia. And so that changes the nature of the game. And the Pope escapes. You have the Treaty of Paris. They reestablish the papacy. So Pope Pius VII, Cardinal Chiaramonti, that's right. And he was a Benedictine, and he was elected Pope after Pius VI died in French control. And the French directory ordered Napoleon to guard all, when Napoleon was still just a general, guard all the roads, don't allow anyone to elect a pope. And they basically said that the directory has decreed the end of the office of the papacy. Well, that's nice, but God hadn't. So miraculously, people thought, they all managed to assemble under Austrian protection, and they elect Cardinal Chiaramonti to be, and then Pius VII. And so, and that's troubling, because then the Austrian Emperor Joseph II, who actually himself championed a lot of French revolutionary ideas before they were cool, he had, was trying to get Pius VII to stand with him against Napoleon, but he's like, I'm not that stupid. Napoleon just pasted your armies a few years ago. I'm going to try to stay neutral, which he does, and he affects a relationship with Napoleon, but it all goes south in the eventually, as everything, plays out. So now, it's after the war, and he says, now it's time to address a great evil that was done before the war, namely the suppression. So he undoes the suppression of the Jesuits. And by this time, of course, Catherine the Great was dead, and now you had Alexander III as the czar, and he had no use for the Jesuits. And so we wouldn't mind if they all departed. And so they do. And so, but it's those members with other disparate elements that recreate the order, which changes its character a little bit. It's not the same order as the one that was suppressed.
Yeah, what kind of order? What was the new mentality going forward?
The new mentality, not that every single person was this way, because there were very many holy and good theologians, but there is a worldly spirit that enters the Jesuits at that point, that's involved more heavily in politics and the sciences, and looks upon that as where they need to be. There's definitely more of a onset of within the 19th century would have been called liberal thinking that infects a lot of the Jesuits, not all, like I said, but a good number. And they come to very prominent positions in in the church and in state, and some are really holy at spend all the time in prayer and study, like Cardinal Franzlin, who was a praetus at Vatican I. And then you have some that especially in the next century that completely lost their faith and basically consider themselves scientists using the church as a platform, namely like Teilhard de Chardin, who was the greatest heresiarch of the 20th century, easily.
Yeah. So is that sort of where their sort of chivalric notions kind of end?
I think so, and at least in my opinion. And I've seen in the judgment of some other historians that at least there's some disagreement on the nature and the aims of the order, like to what extent those changed. But everyone agrees the character of the order definitely changed after the restoration of the Jesuits. So, and I've boiled it down to generally the thrust of the order's operations are a very worldly spirit. It's again, like I said, not because every single person was worldly, but whatever they're doing, it's seen as a worldly endeavor and not a sacred one. And so conquering these missions for Christ, conquering these fields for Christ has given way to making a Jesuit the most prominent person in this field.
Yeah. So
that's a change.
Yeah, that's interesting change. And it does seem like that it's more important that the physical aspects of things are more maintained than the spiritual aspects, at least nowadays. Would or I guess in hindsight, would restoration even have been the right move?
Well, it's tough to answer that from the standpoint of the 19th century, after the aftermath of Napoleon and so many things, because we look at it in the light of the Jesuits since Vatican II, dying like flies for liberation theology in some Latin American country, or dancing around with rainbow flags and guitars and banners and making a mockery of the sacred liturgy, or resistance to popes whenever they command anything that is even slightly conservative, but full embrace when they do anything that's rather liberal, is saying the most theologically daft things you can imagine. That's what we think of when we think of Jesuits now.
Yeah.
People don't even think of trying to take over the world and that sort of thing. That's once in a while you find someone, either Rothschilds and the Jesuits and the Vatican, they all running the Illuminati and the whole world. You get a few of those here and there, but generally, and their numbers they're dying out fast. So that problem might be solved for us because of all their numbers. They're all people that are on the verge of retirement. So that may sort itself out for all we know. But but it's hard to look at the 1820s because we're always tempted to look at it via the 1960s through today. And so in the 1820s, it was seen as, correcting a great evil. And nobody at that point could see great evil around the road in terms of all the craziness that would come about.
Yeah, true. But so as we stand now, I mean, you said that the Jesuits might sort of end themselves in the sense of the fact that they have such an old clergy that and don't have many seminarians and such. Would it be apt for the order to end, or is there hope of a true restoration of what the Jesuits were meant to be?
It's not impossible if you have the right people that are of a very that are not of a worldly spirit. In theory, that could be done. Maybe just make a brand new order of however you would do that. I used to know some very good holy Jesuits. There's one British Jesuit I ran into one time. Oh man, he must have been pushing 80s. This is back about 20 years ago when I was living in Rome, and he was really clever, really holy, really orthodox. You could tell. And so it must have been, a crucible to be in the order, given the way it was. So there are people like that out there. Who knows if they don't come to prominence? But at the present, it's one of those things where it's going to just the numbers, and like all the rest of the orders too, that are having similar problems. I think just the numbers game.
Yeah, makes sense. So
But
I think
martyrs out of them by suppressing them and making it 10 times worse.
say that again.
Well, it's better than making martyrs out of them by, you act to suppress them. And now it's like, look, we're being persecuted. We've just let their own devices take them away. It'll create less sympathy for them.
Makes sense. Yeah. Good strategy. But yeah, so I think that's where we should leave it today. It's been a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And is there anything you'd like to plug to the audience?
Certainly. So I run Mediatrix Press, which is devoted to bringing traditional books and books that should be in print, as well as translations of things, particularly St. Robert Bellarmine's one I've been translating. So I've been working on that, on the translations for a while. I reprint old books that are out of copyright, especially on Lives of the Saints that nobody's ever heard of but should have. And so you can find all of those things at www.mediatrixpress.com.
Okay. Thank you for coming on, Ryan.
Thank you for letting me come on and blab. I always appreciate it.
Yeah. But for the audience to support us here at Plotlines, please like, share, and subscribe. And thank you. And please come back next time. Have a good day. Bye.